Y'all ready? Ready? Let's talk. How was break? I know. Ugh, I know. Ugh. It was too short, right? It'd be much better if we had more time off. Everything is so stressful and dealing with, oh, you had a good, somebody said they had a nice, yeah, it was, it was nice, and didn't have to be anywhere in particular. And that was good. And, takes a little pressure off of you. Some of you use the time to catch up, and that's good. Um, but free time for you to do whatever you want is pretty important. We are struggling to get through the um, media campaigns and elections section, and I, even though I've done that professionally and been associated with campaigns and commercials and that sort of thing, it's not my favorite thing in the world. And so some of this stuff is rather obvious to me, but it may not be obvious to you. And so it's nice to get some questions about how this works and what's important to know about media campaigns and elections. Let's talk a little bit about media and what do we mean when we say media. It used to be once upon a time. I know y'all don't like my stories that start with once upon a time because old people are telling you some story. Okay, so I realize that. I'll try to make this as painless as possible. Early news was presented to populations through the printed press. There would not have been an American Revolution if it were not for um, Common Sense, Thomas Paine's pamphlet distributed. Washington ordered that every soldier get a copy of Common Sense. And those soldiers then took that home and it was discussed with family. It was a marvelous way of spreading revolution, the printed word. And I want to say that we are living through 24-hour news cycles. And so every little nuance, every little remark gets incredible scrutiny. So it's very important that candidates truly understand the import of communicating. We still use print. Print is not dead. It's different than it was. It's evolved. It's still important. Several of the colonies had printers and occasional newspapers. And I want you to realize that Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton owned newspapers. It is not unusual for political figures to recognize the import of media and communicating their message. That's what that's all about. Newspapers spread information about local events and activities, but the stamp tax of 1765 raised costs for publishers, leading several newspapers to fold under the increased cost of paper. And I want you to realize that then that tax on newspapers was really, a conflict of interest, to explain it to you that way. For government to collect a tax on what is printed and distributed about government is really a conflict of interest, and that's why we do not tax newspapers now, because we want them to be independent from any government threat. Taxes, the power to tax can be regarded as the power to destroy. So that's a wonderful remark. And newspapers, um, the newspapers are always going to have some level of bias. They may be any government, they may be any political party. And so you have to learn to filter through some of that, because I firmly believe that politics cannot be taken out of people. Everything you do is a political act. Everything. If you look at it that way, you recognize that people are making a statement. I'll give you an example, and people were critical of this, but nonetheless, it does resonate, or it wouldn't have been out there. Let me take a drink here, and we'll move forward. I'm sure that y'all have been following the war in Ukraine. This may be sort of your first big war to deal with, and it is incredibly stressful, especially during this 24-hour news cycle, and it compels the participants to manage their media exposure and the images that you see. You are developing an opinion based on how that set where they're talking to you is designed. And so I'll give you an example of the kind of scrutiny that media has and plays in our homes. Y'all been following the Ukraine war, and so the leader of Ukraine and the leader of the opposition to Putin is a guy named it just floated right out of my head. Zelensky. And interestingly enough, that Z is not represented the same way in that language as it is in ours, but Zelensky. When he's on camera, notice that he's wearing a t-shirt. He is not wearing a coat and tie. Do you realize that he is sending you a message by the way he is dressed? Anybody want to talk about that or address that? Why? Can y'all have I got you muted? I don't want you to be muted. Have I got you all muted? You're okay. You ought to be able to answer. So what do you think about that no coat and tie? Does that to show he's one of us, exactly. And to show some kind of solidarity with his troops, okay? They're not necessarily uniformed. This is sort of a ragtag kind of rebellion, and for them to have uniforms is sort of an unusual thing. Yeah, to show that he has a normal life. I don't know, what's normal in Ukraine. I want you to realize that before this conflict started, Zelensky wore a coat and tie as president of Ukraine, out of respect for the office. Why don't American presidents present themselves that way? Why don't American presidents wear uniforms? Any idea? I mean, they are the commander in chief, but remember, they're a civilian, not part of the military, but over the military. So they don't wear uniforms. They're not part of the military, but they wear a coat and tie. Or sometimes you see Biden without his coat on. Sometimes you see them without their coats. But in an official capacity, coat and tie is de rigueur for our presidents. Do y'all know why? His power doesn't come from the military. His power comes from the Constitution. And so we expect our presidents not to wear uniforms. When Zelensky addressed Congress, he was wearing that t-shirt, and he's got a flag usually beside him, and he looks like he's in an office somewhere, but it's not the presidential office in the Capitol. So what's going on with that? to show that he has a normal life. Well, that olive green that he's wearing is sort of a military dress without looking military, but olive green is pretty much full of military color. Um, he is projecting an image with that. He's trying to say that the trappings of power are not his concern, that his concern is with people. And I think that's fascinating that that's conveyed by what he's wearing on television. But before all of this started, he was a coat and tie kind of guy. So the office of the presidency in Ukraine conformed more to Western expectations of that office. And if you think that uniforms don't matter or that uniforms aren't important to the message that's being, telephoned or videoed to you, telegraphed is the expression too. Stalin always wore a uniform. Mussolini always wore a uniform. Che Guevara wore fatigues, kind of a sloppy looking uniform. Castro always wore a uniform, and they were impeccably tailored for him. People who want to line up with the perception that they are revolutionary, oddly enough, may wear a uniform which also signals conformity. So, Zelensky is not per se in a uniform, other than he's sort of, if you were casting this as a movie, you would have him in a t-shirt as he is. And I mean, he worked in show business, y'all. He gets this. He knows what he's doing. He's trying to definitely identify as just a guy whose responsibility fell on him, that he didn't seek this responsibility, but he's just like the neighborhood guy who saved somebody from a burning building. He's just a guy, and that's what he's trying to communicate to people. So now, rather than be focused on print media, but it's still important, okay? It's still important because most people don't, by the way, read newspapers now. I'm a big newspaper reader. And so it still matters to get a sense of media movers and shakers about what is going on out there, and you can get that from the editorial pages. One concern I have as an educator is this. Frankly, I believe you should have a 3-hour credit course in media. Everyone should have it. The business school, everyone should have it. What I'm driving at here is that you need to be sensitive to the ideology of newspapers. Newspapers have bias. I was discussing this with some friends the other day who really like British news. They listen to the BBC, and they do that because they say innocently, well, there's no bias there. There's no Democrat or Republican there. Well, that's because in Great Britain, it's either Labour or Tory. The British media is just like everybody else. They take sides. And the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, is not a private company. It gets government sponsorship. And so what you're getting is the government line when you're listening to the BBC, the British government's line when you're listening to them. And that's not a bad thing. I just think people are not very aware of that. And you should pay attention to that kind of influence. There are conservative newspapers in America. There are liberal newspapers in America. If you want the conservative view, the Wall Street Journal is probably the leading conservative paper in the country. If you want more of a liberal approach to news, then reading the New York Times is where that's at. That's a much more liberal paper. The Washington Post is a cautious paper, and they don't want. It's like they don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. But the well, the Washington Post is a legendary newspaper, as is the New York Times. The New York Times is the official paper of record, if you will. If you want to read about something that happened 100 years ago, go to the New York Times, and you know that there's an authentic tone and well researched, that kind of thing. Although I was doing research for my master's thesis, and I was reading the New York Times, and in the New York Times, they had declared the leader, Vladimir Lenin, dead like 3 times. So you have to be cautious about this sort of thing, and you have to come to newspaper without innocence. How do you learn about government? Well, you innocently read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, or, if you want to localize that, the Dallas Morning News is a very conservative newspaper. It's owned, and media ownership is tremendously important to this discussion. Radio, and I don't know about y'all, but I have Sirius radio in the car and in the house, and y'all know that term, or that company, Sirius. Um, Really, Howard Stern helped build that network, and so Howard Stern, he's made his fortune off of kind of vulgarity broadcasting. He's taken what's called a shock jock approach in his interviews, and he asks questions that maybe friends would ask each other, but is that really appropriate or revealing for news media personalities to ask that kind of thing? And I just want to interject one thing here. If you think Howard Stern is vulgar, and sometimes I'm kind of an old fogey about that, I'm like, whoa, I can't believe he broadcast that. But other countries have much more shocking, for lack of a better term, media practices, um, much more openness about some things that Americans are just not ready for. A friend of mine that I was up late talking to last night, he and I were talking about some of the direction and some of the controversial issues, and he used the terminology. He said some Americans are just not ready for some of this. And I thought that was really very telling, not only about his politics, but it helps explain why some people are shocked or surprised about the direction that the country is rapidly moving. It's a very complex time to be studying government, and I want you to keep that in mind. So if you're having frustration or anger or resentment about what you're seeing in government now, and by government I also mean socially, and the sociological impact of some of these rapid changes have on government. Change has an impact on you, uh, and media is so fast paced and so difficult to observe. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. The broadcast, uh, cable broadcast, cable news like CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, they are not regulated by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and they were designed to regulate what's broadcast through the airwaves, not what comes into your house through the cable. Okay, they don't regulate cable, and so I'll hear students say, "How do they?" And that's kind of a nebulous term. They, who are they? How do they let media say these things and do these things? I mean, I've read the most outrageous things on Facebook. Facebook is a medium. There's very little regulation of Facebook. There's far more regulation of radio than there is Facebook. And where do a lot of Americans get their news? Facebook. So it's pretty dramatic to see and to impress upon students that there is precious, precious, precious little regulation of media, and we like it that way. Americans really forget that there is a nexus, that means a focal point of different ideas and different ways of expressing them. And so there is some regulation of media, and we've done that through regulations that are more suggested than enforced. It's not easy to enforce media regulations now, and it depends on who the chairperson of the FCC is. And that chairperson has the responsibility of really setting the tone for regulation. If you look at the Federal Communications Commission and you look at them, say through USA.gov, which is a really good open search engine for government agencies, USA.gov, all right. If you look at the Federal Communications Commission, and that's what we mean when we say FCC. Don't let all these alphabet agencies trip you up. Stop me and ask me, what does that mean? Okay. The Federal Communications Commission regulates interstate and international communications through cable, radio, television, satellite, and wire. The goal of the commission is to promote connectivity and ensure a robust and competitive market. Facebook, by the way, is practically a monopoly. There are other organizations like Facebook, or Meta, as it calls itself now, communications company, but they don't have the punch or the power or the volume of followers that Facebook has with it. But the Federal Communications Commission has really practically given up in some areas of regulation. I'm always fascinated by what they will allow, and if we look at their regulation of cable and satellite, they don't really regulate them very strictly. And sometimes the language that people use on radio and television, when I was growing up, there was an infamous radio broadcast of a fellow named George Carlin, and I know people are sensitive today about Dave Chappelle and his routines, and oh, that's so offensive. Oh, how do they allow that kind of thing to go? If you think Dave Chappelle is offensive, you haven't been listening. Offensive humor has been sort of the hallmark of modern stand-up comedy, which, by the way, stand-up comedy is extremely political. It's very political. Some comedians sidestep that and don't get into politics, and then you have some comedians that are in your face about the political aspects of, say, the kind of humor that they do. Situational comedy is what it's called. You've got somebody like Seinfeld, and he is probably the king of situational comedy, and he's not political. I mean, when he talks to people, you realize what his politics are, but he does not do political humor. Um, that freedom, though, that he enjoys was really created by somebody named Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce was uh, a somewhat underground yet popular comedian when I was a child. And Bruce really was cutting edge about what you could do in comedy, or better yet, let's call it social commentary. He would get arrested routinely when he was doing his routine, and he said words that upset people. And we do, or we did at that time, have obscenity laws that can get you arrested for the use of particular language or particular. But there have been people, and they're very important to the politics of our country and to our politics and social interaction. Broadcast media did not regulate the FCC did not really regulate cable and satellite television um, until about 1965, and the rules that were written then are useless now, uh, largely because of the evolution of the medium. It's changed so dramatically. People like Lenny Bruce, people like George Carlin, people like Richard Pryor were pushing the envelope, to use the cliche. And do y'all know what that means? It's a pilot expression to really get way out there, to get as close to outer space as you possibly can, pushing the envelope. You won't stay in control of that nice safe envelope. Well, what's happened is these guys have pushed what is acceptable in public conversations. And so they're kind of important for you to know who these people are. If you're interested in Lenny Bruce, there is a really good movie about him that Dustin Hoffman played the character of Lenny Bruce in this movie called Lenny, that was directed by Bob Fosse. And it was an explosive kind of picture that really had quite deep social meaning and political meaning. What Bruce was doing was using words that we use in our regular conversations with each other, but he was saying it out in public, and he would get arrested for that. Cable and satellite television, now regulated by the FCC, Congress added Title VI to the Cable Communications Policy Act of 1984 and made some substantial modifications in the regulation of cable television and competition in that act in 1992. Further modifications to promote cross-modal competition, in other words, television, video, and that kind of technology, were made in the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And those acts really began under the Clinton administration, and they were tremendously important to politics in terms of getting their message out. Broadcast television and radio stations are subject to FCC regulations, including restrictions against indecency or obscenity. Now, it's time to really talk about a Supreme Court case that deals with the concept of obscenity. And I want you to understand that some of us are purist when it comes to talking about obscenity in terms of what some people might consider obscene. Other people are not offended by it. So I want you to understand that this concept of indecency or obscenity is really incredibly difficult to understand. In a Supreme Court case called Miller versus California, one of the Supreme Court justices, Potter Stewart, made the comment that he could not define pornography, but he knew it when he saw it. And what was done in Miller versus California is a standard of trying to get a handle on what would be obscene. Okay. In that particular case, and you can go to that Oyez site. Here, let me pull back a little bit. I'm sitting close. Oops, my chair doesn't. I got a new rug, and I don't think it helps my chair roll very well. We'll see. That Oyez website to look at the Supreme Court decision, and this is such a great site. It's www.oyez, and that's spelled O-Y-E-Z. It's French. .organization. Okay, it's a wonderful website that allows you to search. And I'm going to try to share this. You know, we really have problems with sharing with WebEx, and that's kind of a problem with it, isn't it? That we can't readily share what's available there. But let me see if I can come back to y'all with that. There I am. I can see me, but let's see if I can share Oyez with you. Oops. I always have trouble with this. I know y'all are tired of me not readily being able to just do this like they do on television. But it's not as easy, you know, to do this. See. Here we go, share. And I want to share the screen. And let's see, window or select window or screen, which then it doesn't really allow me to do that. It's so frustrating. But promise me that you will. I'm going to type the site for you. And you can go to that site to see what we're talking about. Don't lose this, okay? Miller versus California. Very important Supreme Court case. And they tried. This came down in 1973. And it, I think, is kind of time bound because the 70s, the 60s in terms of expression, it just exploded. The freedom and the ability to communicate in public just exploded with, like I said, Lenny Bruce, with George Carlin. I think the Tonight Show was really important in terms of pushing that. And then, of course, in the 70s, y'all are going to smile about this, but Saturday Night Live was tremendously important in terms of getting people to be more comfortable about self-expression. And it's still an important venue. And the show is very political. And so political humor is difficult for Americans to swallow. And so they sort of dress it up and sneak political humor by people. But looking at Miller versus California, let me give you the facts of the case. Miller, after conducting a mass mailing campaign to advertise the sale of adult material, he was convicted of violating a California statute prohibiting the distribution of obscene material. Some unwilling recipients of Miller's brochures complained to the police and initiated the legal proceedings. The question that the Supreme Court had to deal with is this: in the sale and distribution of obscene material by mail protected, is the sale and distribution of obscene materials by mail protected under the First Amendment's freedom of speech guarantee? Well, the conclusion is in a 5-4 decision. And when you have a 5-4 decision, when the court splits like that, it means that one person on the court could readily retire, and that means a new person coming on the court could have an impact and reverse that decision or redefine that decision as the situation comes before the court. In a 5-4 decision, watch those opinions, y'all, because they could readily change. The court held that obscene materials did not enjoy First Amendment protection. The court modified the test for obscenity established in Roth versus United States and Memoirs versus Massachusetts, holding that the basic guidelines for the trier of fact must be, first, whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work, taken as a whole, not just one word here and one word there, but taken as a whole, appeals to, and here's your SAT word for the day, prurient interest. Prurient, let me spell it for you, Prurient. Now, what the heck does that word mean? That word means unusual or obsessive interest, unhealthy interest in something that, like I said, would be unusual. Okay, so that means, and it usually has something to do with unusual or unhealthy, or shall we say bizarre, particularly sexual interest. Okay, and I mean obsessively. Okay, whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work, taken as a whole, appeals to prurient interest. That's a hard word to say, by the way. Whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way. Patently offensive is usually the way people say that word. You could say patently offensive. Okay. And what does that mean? Obviously offensive. On its face, offensive. Okay. Whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law. And finally, whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious, and I want you to write the acronym out, SLAP, lacks serious scientific value, literary, artistic, or political. See how that spells SLAP? scientific value, literary, artistic, or political value. The court rejects the utterly without redeeming social value test of the memoir's decision. It used to be that you could say, well, this writing is utterly without redeeming social value. Well, let me ask y'all something. Does this create a usable standard for you? Can you look at, say, the entertainment that you enjoy? Can you look at the entertainment that you enjoy and say that it passes the Miller test? What is that Miller test again? You know, kind of in an edited way. Does the work that you are looking at appeal to abnormal sexual interest? Whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law. In other words, what's the state law about this? And does this just violate that state law blatantly, openly, violate that state law? Whether the work taken as a whole lacks, now remember slap's your friend, scientific, literary, artistic, or political value. Well, can anybody look at that standard, the Miller standard? Can anybody look at that standard and think, well, what does obscene mean? One person's art is another person's obscenity. In other words, y'all, what did the court do with that Miller standard? They came up with something that is so, the word I'm looking for is so difficult to enforce. Community standards. What does that mean? Do you think that people who live in Katy, Texas, have the same view or community standards as people who live over in the Montrose area? Do people who live in New York have the same values as people who live in Houston? In other words, community standards really had to be interpreted to mean everywhere, not just Waco, Texas, but Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, New York, LA. In other words, that community has to be pretty broad because people in Katy are different than people in Montrose, right? People in Montrose might be more accepting of things than people in Katy, or people in Sugar Land. So what you're thinking about this? Well, recently, the Supreme Court was called upon to look at the FCC's censorship with regard to what was going out on television. In 1987, there was a Supreme Court case called Pacifica, the FCC versus Pacifica. Do y'all know Pacifica? It's a radio network. And in this particular case, what happened was an FM radio, and by the way, AM was the popular medium. FM became the medium of sort of underground college radio stations, progressive approaches to discussions of politics and news, and they would play different kinds of music. AM radio would play a song that might be 2 minutes and 30 seconds, but FM would play a 12-minute song. That was really amazing to a lot of people, and FM really caught on with certain groups. What Pacifica Radio did at WBAI in New York City aired a broadcast that featured a segment which the comedian and social commentator George Carlin, part of his routine was a little segment known as Filthy Words, and this became known as the filthy word case. A few weeks after they broadcast this, a guy named John Douglas, who was an active member of a group called Morality in Media, stated in a complaint filed with the FCC that he heard the broadcast while he was driving with his 15-year-old son, and he stated that the material was inappropriate for the time of day. In response, Pacifica received a letter of reprimand from the FCC, censuring them for allegedly violating broadcast regulations, which prohibited the airing of indecent material. Now, if I played that monologue that George Carlin did, if I played that for y'all, most of you, some of you would be offended. Most of you would not be offended. But the important thing for you to realize, and you can listen to the routine on the internet. I mean, it's just everywhere. You can listen to it. What Carlin does is he says, there are 7 words that you cannot say on television. That people at the FCC just go nuts about this. What Carlin was doing was pushing that envelope again, trying to get the Supreme Court to define obscenity better than this vague concept of what is obscene. For Carlin, really, at that time, nothing would have been regarded as obscene. Today, there are things that we routinely hear of that Carlin had no idea about. So this is all very fluid and very dynamic. The important thing that you should get from this FCC Pacifica case is some things are not appropriate to broadcast in the middle of the day when children might hear that broadcast. I have a friend that I went to Baylor with, and he's a professor in New York, and he asked me to write a piece for a magazine that he edits, and he said, well, I really need you to turn it in early so that I have a chance to edit out your cuss words. And he said, for the children. And that's kind of a code word and kind of a joke for us that kids shouldn't see some things at certain times in their life, and that people are just too darn young to be reading that because they don't know how to handle it or contextualize it or whatever. So it's a running joke with us, for the children. We need to do this for the children, and we mean it sarcastically. We usually just reserve it for things that we don't want to do anyway. So we say, well, for the children. The point of this is that the Supreme Court would run into some controversy with some other individuals that routinely are part of our day-to-day life. The FCC really had a difficult time regulating this with things that happen and occur on television routinely. And I'm thinking back, and y'all may not have even been around then. It actually wasn't that old. There was a halftime show here in Houston for the Super Bowl, and Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson performed. And when they did, there was what euphemistically became known as a wardrobe malfunction that occurred during the halftime show. What happened? I'm not gonna shock anybody by saying this. I don't think. Please, and if you're offended, I'm sorry that I offend you. Ms. Jackson was performing with Justin Timberlake, and they were acting out, if you will, pantomiming, if you will, the lyric of the song. And Timberlake reached over to the bodice of Ms. Jackson's costume or clothing, if you will, and he ripped the covering off the bodice. He ripped it and exposed Ms. Jackson's nude breast on worldwide television. Oddly enough, they anticipated that this was going to happen. It really wasn't an accident. He didn't accidentally tear it off of her. And the reason that I'm familiar with that is because it was revealed that she had purchased some jewelry from a store in Houston and wore that underneath the cup of that bodice, so that when he ripped it off, the jewelry was visible. And in the law, we would say that that was intentional, and she had it on her mind when she purchased that jewelry and then wore it, knowing from rehearsal what was going to happen. It was a huge scandal. I found it interesting that people were more upset about the exposure of her breast than the violence of ripping the clothes off of a woman worldwide. That Timberlake didn't catch as much heat as Janet Jackson did. The FCC fined the halftime show of the Super Bowl, and later on in 2006, George W. Bush signed into law the Broadcast Decency Enforcement Act, sponsored by then Senator Sam Brownback, a former broadcaster himself. And it was endorsed by Congressman Fred Upton of Michigan, who authored a similar bill in the House. The new law stiffens the penalties for a violation of the act. The Federal Communications Commission will be able to impose fines in the amount of, hold your breath now, $325,000. You think the Super Bowl could pay that? I'm sure they could. By each station that violates decency standards. The legislation raised the fine 10 times over the previous maximum of $32,500 per violation. So they want to fine every television station that broadcast material that might be found obscene. What y'all can put your mind to about this is asking the question, and it's a legal question. What is obscene? Where do we draw the line with that? Some interesting things came about since then. The musician Bono won an award at an award show, and it was televised, and he used some euphemism that's probably pretty common to you and me to express excitement that he won. Well, it was broadcast all over television, all over the place, all over the public square, that he said that. And one of the presenters of the award was Cher, who is known quite well for pushing that envelope in terms of what is acceptable, that some people think she borders on the uh, the line there. She's walking the line there about what is obscene. She's fairly open about her clothing. She's old enough to be your grandmother. She's definitely old enough to be my old aunt, you know. Um, but forward she goes, and she's never let age stop her in terms of expressing herself. And so people have been, questioning her with regard to obscenity for years. And so she's kind of delighted that Bono gave them an opportunity to do that kind of thing. And y'all have seen incidents of this too. I mean, Madonna on David Letterman was regarded as being obscene. You might be asking yourself, how do they, how do they keep these things from being broadcast? I mean, isn't there some kind of control mechanism for how these things make it on television, or how they fail to keep these things off television or radio? That might be a better way of putting it. Not how do they allow this? No, really, correctly, I should be saying, how did they fail to prevent this? Well, all of this stuff about obscene words, and I know you think, oh, this really doesn't matter, it's not very important. The FCC wanted to avoid labeling. I mean, and this shows you the evolution of the FCC and how much they've changed over the years. They wanted to avoid fining anybody for using language that is somewhat inappropriate. You have to realize that television stations, the director on a television station has about a 7-second delay. So he hears or she hears things 7 seconds before the rest of humanity hears it. And she's got her finger on that editing button, on the mute button, where she can mute before you have an opportunity, for the children to avoid hearing something obscene. And so do Americans have a right to that? Is that really an important thing? Well, when you tell someone, when a government agency tells someone that they can't utter an expletive on national television, I want you to realize that that is the government suppressing speech. There's a fine line between obscenity and speech. And when the FCC regulates speech, they're making a political deal out of it, y'all. They're making a political deal out of it. So the FCC said, we really can't get upset about Bono using that expletive when the Vice President of the United States at the time, Dick Cheney, told Patrick Leahy, and y'all will see him periodically here this week. Leahy is the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he's listening to the Supreme Court nominee and asking questions of the new Supreme Court nominee. So you see him. And by the way, if you like Batman movies, Leahy is in a pivotal moment of a Batman movie because the Joker grabs him and ask him a question. And you're like, dang, that's Senator Patrick Leahy there in this movie. When Dick Cheney told Patrick Leahy on the floor of the United States Senate to use an expletive to explain what he wanted Leahy to do to himself. Once the vice president says that on C-SPAN, on live television, Katie bar the door. You cannot regulate political speech that's broadcast, no matter what time of day it is. And so I've noticed, because I used to work in broadcasting and I teach you government, I've noticed that we've gotten a lot more open and fair and honest about our portrayals of free speech. And so we really don't do much of a job of regulating anything with regard to expression. I will say that the three networks, the three major networks, the broadcast networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, they don't do it as much because not everybody has cable, and a lot of people depend upon those three networks for their information. But cable, Netflix, Prime Video, the Movie Channel, Turner Movie Classics, those things that are on cable, just about anything goes. I've heard some mighty creative cussing and colorful language, shall we say, in movies on my television that are cable and not network broadcast. If they were on network broadcasting, a lot of that stuff would be cut out with that 7-second delay button. We've yacked quite a bit here today about censorship and the politics of censorship, and what you should get out of this is the notion of what the FCC is and what their role is and what they do. And you should familiarize yourself with the Supreme Court case, Miller versus California, and the old expression of, I don't know what obscenity is, but I know it. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. That's kind of an important element here. Do y'all have questions or comments? Y'all are so quiet today. It must be hard to get back in the routine of school because you needed a good spring break. I hope you got it, but it sure is hard to get your engine revving again. I will say this, by the way, about spring break. I have mixed emotions about it. You know, you got kids in Miami shooting each other. They're all out on spring break. They're kind of lumping everybody together with regard to that. Some colleges and universities would like to do away with spring break. It breaks the rhythm of the semester. Kids get hurt. There's a lot of overdosing on spring break, or just now out and out shooting each other. So I have mixed emotions about it. I think we need more time off for ourselves to kind of re-energize. But on the other hand, I don't want you guys, you know, falling off of balconies at hotels or shooting each other, for heaven's sakes. And by the way, let me say this about that. Spring break is really not needed for people in this country to be violent toward each other. The level of violence day to day is pretty outrageous. But notice that we were talking about obscenity, but not violence. Well-known actor Jack Nicholson said, you know, you can kill a woman on television, depict killing a woman on television, but you can't depict intense sexual activity with a woman on television. He was trying to say that the violence of television may be more objectionable than the depictions of human sexuality on television. Any questions about any of this or comments about any of this? Your generation has been much more open with their expression than my generation was. Y'all don't know who Lenny Bruce is, or George Carlin, or Richard Pryor, but see, we still have controversy about what comedians can say in public before an audience. Do y'all have questions about any of this? Comments about any of this?
No, it's okay.
You're good? Are you sure? All right, let's quit,
I have a
and I
I have a
will. Oh,
question about the message you send on the announcements.
uh-huh.
About the hold on. About the writing assignment.
Discussion assignment
Yeah,
and
about the
turning
writing.
that into your research paper assignment. You guys have done such a good job that I really think that you should get. I mean, I'm just fascinated with reading what y'all wrote, and y'all were very um, sensitive toward each other and really smart. And I like the exercise a lot. I started out being kind of angry about it because somebody told me to do it, and that's usually my response to things. Um, but I've been really impressed with it. So what's your question, Mr. Woods?
I have a question about the so the message you send, well, what I'm like reading here is that do we just basically like have to redo it to get more deeper idea like you said? If so, then how many words? And
Um,
also, would this be our research mandatory like writing assignment that
yeah, it would be. And look at it this way, you're more than halfway finished with it if we counted it at that. All I want you to do, and my problem with your assignment originally was this. It's not very well balanced. The information that was provided had a slant to it that might get you to form an opinion about the issue before you had an opportunity to explore it better. And so all I'm asking you to do, I'll put it to you this way. If I give you 3 articles, which I'm thinking about doing, and you look at those 3 articles, really all you need to do is tell me if it changed your point of view from the original writing, and if so, why?
okay.
And I just thought that you should, like I said in the instructions, have a better set of research before you're asked an opinion about something that you may not ever have thought about before. I
Okay.
just thought that it needed a little balance to it.
I
I'm not
understand.
asking y'all to reinvent what you did. You can add to it as a simple comment. You don't have to go to the trouble of writing the number of words that you did. Normally, if I was giving you a research paper assignment, I would tell you about 1,200 words. And that's a lot for a conversation, but it's pretty easy to arrive at that if you're commenting with each other. I'm kind of experimenting with y'all because I've never done this kind of thing before. I've never had a discussion oriented thing. I've always just allowed people to express themselves in research papers. And what I'm finding is it might be, and y'all tell me if this is if you bond with this, if you think it's right or wrong, or I don't know what I'm talking about, that the format of a formal research paper is first of all intimidating. It scares you out of your mind that you think, "Oh my gosh, did I plagiarize any of this?" And what does plagiarism really mean? And it's a very serious thing. You don't want to plagiarize. But what I found with the discussion thing is that y'all were more human, less robotic, less formal, but you were open and very kind to each other, which I really enjoyed seeing that. Y'all praised each other, and when you disagreed, you did so without destroying, you know, another um, another human. I mean, I just thought that you did a really fine job, and I'm kind of asking you to add sort of maybe a paragraph to what you've already done. Uh, so, what do y'all think? Is that doable? I know y'all have a lot to read. I don't want to burden you with that, but I'd
Would
like
I
to go ahead.
would I make another paragraph past the original word count, or is the word
Yeah,
count like change?
yeah. I think just another paragraph, like a response, you know,
Okay.
just kind of respond. I don't necessarily want you to reinvent the word. Some of you, though, need to run spell check before you turn something in. I'm the world's worst speller. And if it were not for spell check, I wouldn't have had a life. It's that important. Run spell check, okay? Because you're communicating to each other and you want to do so without your reader stumbling over something that's misspelled. When you spell correctly, you're really helping your reader not trip over something. Okay. So run spell check for me. There's even grammar check. You can run that too. Because I don't want to ding y'all for anything like that that you could fix. Question? You were going to say something?
Also, can it be like any word count or just the enough amount of words? I'm just trying to make sure this is accurate so I don't like,
Well, I don't
go
want you to
overboard.
say in one sentence, yeah, this reading changed my whole mind.
Yeah, that's
No,
obvious, but I just
no.
want to make sure that.
You guys are never at a loss for words, okay?
Oh, okay.
So spill some words for me,
All
and
right.
don't agonize about the word count. See, that business about agonizing about words, you know, I don't believe that this should be like pulling teeth, that I have to pull this out of you. I want you to think about it in terms of you're expressing yourself about a political question, and your words are sacred. Your
Mhm.
words are a holy thing. Words are so dramatic and so important, but limiting you to a word count, gosh, y'all, that seems like it kind of limits your ability to express yourself. I don't want to cut you off, but I also don't want to experience, gee, I wonder what they really think because they're not telling me that with these 3 sentences. Ugh, okay? So, it's your opportunity to really cut loose, look at it that way. And you're in competition, if you would, with other people. So you want to be kind of impressive in your word use. But I don't want y'all to go back and because you don't have time. I don't want you to go back and just rewrite the paper. You know, this could be handled well as as a reply. All right, and some of y'all have done the initial writing, but you haven't replied to each other yet. And so I wanted to give you some time and ability to do that and the ability to say, well, this is fine, but what about this? What about this other idea? So it's not going to be real painful. Um, some of you have expressed that you don't really want to give your opinion about anything. And that has a lot to do with your view of politics and probably how your parents raised you. Don't talk about politics. Don't talk about religion. Don't talk about anything that might offend anyone. Well, your parents aren't here, so you're not bound by that. Um, it's important for you to begin to think and express yourself politically. And it's kind of interesting to talk to y'all about expression today and then tell you that I'm interested in your point of view about having some balance in this assignment because I want you to realize I didn't write this assignment. It came from above me. And they tell me, don't change anything. Well, there are things in there that y'all didn't know. I wasn't ready to talk to y'all about redistricting. I will be after the next test. But here, that was thrown at you, kind of a curveball. So y'all need more information than what they gave you in this assignment. So it's my job to find you that more information to help you better express yourself. Okay. Any other questions, comments?
Thank you. That answered
Oh,
my
sure.
question.
Oh, sure. And I want y'all to know, I'm not making this up, I'm not hyperbolizing here. I was really impressed with your work, and I think you deserve more credit for it. And I thought, well, my heavens, this is like a research paper, but y'all seem to be kind of freed up from the restrictions of a stuffy research paper. All right. Y'all seem to have unstuffed yourselves. And I like that. I like that. All right.
Prof-
Yes,
Where
sir. Yes, ma'am.
where can we find the 3 articles at?
I'm going to send them to you. Okay.
Okay.
Would y'all want me to send them to you just in an announcement? Would that work?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay. If that's fine, because I could tack it on, but that might be confusing, right?
Yes.
To the original instructions. So I'll just email them to you. Don't worry. Okay.
All right.
And let me give you a tip. Okay. One of the most important things you guys can do is develop your skills of research. There is everything in the world out there on the internet, but if you're not a good researcher, you're cut off from it. So Google does this thing now where they will look at a question, and it's all computer driven. So if I gave you a question, you can write that question into Google and hit send, hit return, and they do the research for you. It's just amazing. And so I get kind of excited about this. So play around with Google and learn to take advantage of this, because it's really neat, the kind of research that it comes up with. Now, by the way, it has its own bias. It has an algorithm that it follows. And so that I'm good at it. It's something that I like to say that I am at least good at looking at Google and researching. But sometimes Google can be kind of confining. But I'm going to give you a couple of articles, just 3, and I'll do that for you today. And you just take a look at them. I'm not telling you to, just like you'd read the newspaper, just kind of a casual read of this, and see if this gave you more information, confused you with this information. Maybe redistricting isn't the bear that some of these articles made it out to be. And if it helps you, I can kind of give you a little bit of my thought about redistricting too, and I'll write that into the announcements, and that'll be something that you can think about. And if you want to, you can reply to me. And I know you're thinking, yeah, but you're gonna ding me if I don't agree with you. No, that's not true. As long as you can express yourself, that's what I'm trying to get you to do, is just express yourself and not think that somebody's going to bite your head off about that. That we can respectfully disagree, we can joyously agree. So we're just practicing civility. That's all the assignment is really about. Okay. Other questions? If you have any, email me those questions, and don't agonize about this. Okay. You leave the agonizing to me about it. All right. All right. I'll see y'all later. It was good to see you. I'm glad you had a good spring break. And let me fuss at y'all for just a moment. Be careful. We could have another round of COVID to worry about. And there's an awful lot of trouble that you can get into out there. I just want y'all to be safe. And if you need to talk about anything, if you need help, by all means, email me. It is, of course, confidential. Okay? Y'all take care. Bye bye.